Jeff, give me an overview of where we're at globally with sustainable aviation fuel, and then where we're at in Canada.
Great. So we're still seeing SAF as a new market that's being created. And we're seeing some good steps forward in terms of the world looking at investing in the facilities to make this. Today, if you look, there's only really two spots that produce SAF in any type of volume. One is in the US on the West Coast in Los Angeles, and the other is in Singapore. And so this is where the majority of SAF today is made, and you're seeing smaller facilities being built across the rest of the jurisdictions. We're also, seeing other places put in place incentives or policies or mandates, so the carrots and sticks discussion that you hear so often, in order to ensure that there is SAF production moving forward. So Europe, for example, has chosen to put mandates in place, and you're seeing some of the industries react to that and start building facilities in order to meet those mandates. The US, through the Inflation Reduction Act, has put in place incentives for the production and have really targeted SAF as one of the go-to products to be able to make by providing a higher incentive. In Canada, we're still not producing any SAF. There's proposals on the table from various companies in order to do so, but they're waiting for a signal from the federal government or some of the provinces to have an investment climate where they are able to make that investment. So we're still seeing zero SAF being produced in Canada today.
Do we have the technology yet to make SAF at scale and do it economically?
Yes. So the question was, do we have the technology? So we know what the pathways are to make the SAF. In our roadmap, which we released in June, we identified the opportunities in Canada using the various feedstocks and the various technology and pathways that are used to convert those feedstocks into SAF to target 1 billion liters of SAF by 2030. Some technologies are more advanced than others, are in a commercial state today, and those are the ones that use actually the used cooking oil, for example, or some of the plant-based oils in order to convert into fuels. And we know that's commercialized, and you see some of those facilities, most of the announced facilities are using that technology. We do see others for some of the more advanced feedstocks that we're targeting. So for example, wood chips or municipal solid waste, with plants again a little bit further, but need a little help to develop from a technology perspective in order to get there. The ultimate fuel that aviation is really chasing is what we call power to liquids. And that technology is one where you use a renewable source of carbon that you collect through technologies similar to direct air capture, for example, from a smokestack, and using green hydrogen and combining those together to make fuel. And for that to happen, those are still expensive and needs a lot of development, and we need hydrogen to come around to make those happen as well.
A few years ago, Energy Media interviewed the LanzaTech folks, and they were talking about their process that used captured CO2, renewable electricity, and a microbe of some kind. Mm-hmm. And I know they're not the only one in the market that's trying to bring that technology forward. Is that viable? Have we got anything like that developing in Canada?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think some of the Canadian oil companies are investors in LanzaJet per se. So LanzaJet actually has a facility which again was financed under some of the programs you see in the US. I believe down in the southern US that's coming online, I believe this year, which is using exactly that process. So we call that process alcohol to jet. So it's taking CO2. They want to use ethanol, which is another source in the US, which has a huge supply chain. And the ethanol producers are really seeing, or in the US specifically, are seeing ethanol demand or ethanol as a source to be able to make jet fuel. So as cars electrify and the demand for gasoline goes down, what do we do with all this ethanol? So alcohol to jet, the LanzaJet processes, for example, is what it's called, is really being looked at seriously by the US in order to sort of create that jet. So it has its challenges like any other technology, so they need to learn how to reduce the carbon intensity of that, because they need sources of renewable energy, and of course they need sources of low carbon feedstock on the ethanol side. So lots of work going on to reduce and improve those scores, but definitely that's a huge opportunity for the US.
Since the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act was introduced in August of 2022, there's been a lot of talk about Canadian technologies maybe be migrating south to take advantage of all of the subsidies that are available. Is that a problem? And if it is, does it sound, because the federal government has said that it plans to meet or match or compete with the U.S. in that way. So what's your take on that?
We haven't seen a signal from the government yet. They're obviously in the fall economic statement yesterday released some news around the investment tax credits for clean hydrogen or clean electricity, for example. There was a mention as well for contract for differences, which we think is a tool that Canada can use to sort of support the production of SAF. But what's really missing is a signal or a program that shows that making an investment in Canada is competitive against the US. Today, that's not there. And what we are seeing is an industrial strategy where you see announcements being made in the States, you see the money available to do so. And what we're really worried about as well is the US putting those things in place. And the thing in the US is that it applies to exports. So as long as it's made in the US, it can be sent elsewhere and still enjoy the incentive that they're getting through the IRA. But the other thing that's important is that might be a pull on our feedstock as well. So we're shy in terms of looking at, is this an opportunity for Canada? We would hate to see a lot of our feedstocks just go down to the south and our friends and have it converted over and then have to buy it back in a more expensive case. So do we make it or do we buy it? And that's the decision we're in right now. And we are working and engaged with the government to sort of make the case that it makes sense to make it here in Canada. From a SAF perspective, I think already today we import probably 30 to 40% of our jet fuel needs. So SAF can be made locally. The feedstock is close to the airports. So we know that this could be a great source for replacement on an import program. We can use our resources. We can strengthen the energy security around it. From a cost perspective, it's still very costly. The technology is a piece of it, but the feedstock is still fairly expensive as well. And that's why I think we need the government to help us out on the incentive and take some of the risk out of the investment to be able to get the scale to be able to reduce the cost at the end of the day.
What's the danger that the American programs put in place the industry to make SAF, then the supply chains, and then it's really hard for Canada to break into that? And what kind of a timeline might we be looking at for that risk?
Right. So this leads back. So in Canada, the aviation and aerospace sector produce approximately 65 billion Canadian of GDP output, sustains about 600,000 direct and indirect jobs. So we are in the process of investigating and doing some impact assessments around what do we want aviation to look like in a net zero future. So one of the main questions you're trying to answer is what happens if we don't decarbonize? What happens to our sector? Are we competitive? Do we get taken over by other jurisdictions? We're seeing the US put in place measures that directly helps and supports decarbonization of their sector. So that really worries how Canadian aviation and aerospace sector are looking at this. The second piece to that is, yes, potentially it is a question being asked, especially by the government on why would we invest in this at all? Let's let the US do it all. We'll just buy back from them. But the US has its targets as well. So the question number one is, are they going to have enough to be able to sell back to Canada? And then the second piece is, will they sell it back competitively, or are we going to have to pay a premium for that? So if we end up paying a premium, again, what does that do to our aviation industry? Are we competitive still? Are we in a position where, from an energy security perspective, we're depending on our neighbors? Or again, it's back to that question, right? Do we make it or do we buy it? Who pays for it? What's the impact on our aviation business?
Jeff, look out over the next 1 or 2 years. What do you foresee for the SAF industry?
We would like to see, and we think there's movement within the federal government. So certainly we are working currently with Transport Canada. They are using the roadmap that we produce to produce as a backbone to producing a SAF blueprint, which will point and identify the actions that the federal government has to take in order to stimulate production of SAF in Canada. So we hope that is a document that at least gets more discussion, rallies the federal family around the SAF issue. What we're finding is that it crosses many departments, so we need a champion within the federal government to help us make this a reality for us. So in the next 2 years, we would hope that we have enough discussions to put in place the right policy framework that's bold, that's deliberate, that considers some of the impacts to aviation, and that puts those building blocks in place to help us pull those investments in order to start making those SAF investments. And we know plants take 3 to 5 years to build anyways. So we want to see the signals in place so that people can make decisions in order to make those investment decisions to start producing near the decade. Our roadmap points to, let's put all these things in place, let's execute the things that we need to do to get there, and really 2030s is where we scale and we start producing real volumes.